a way, this is exactly what happens when we have pyrite oxidation. I said that it forms acid, and that acid is forming inside the slate. And when it forms inside the slate, if you've got any calcium-based minerals around it, often these carbonate minerals, they will react with the acid and cause internal expansion, which again causes the slate almost to explode apart in all sorts of ways. And that's how most of the big failures of slate have occurred, because of pyrite in combination with calcium carbonate in the rock, all naturally there. And the calcium carbonate,
the two together is what really causes
that's the worst
major
case
problem.
scenario, is reacting pyrite with calcium carbonate, also known as calcite. It's exactly the same as the material you'll find in your kettle, limescale. That's calcium carbonate.
So is it possible to have a W1, T1, S1 classification and a high calcium carbonate result?
Not easily. Generally, the higher the calcium carbonate, the more it will be affected by the acid test. It will discolour and do all sorts of things, because that acid will attack that calcium carbonate. So there are some slates out there, particularly Chinese slates, that have very high calcium carbonate content, and there's a different set of tests that you have to do for those to take into account this problem with the carbonates. It doesn't mean to say that carbonate on its own is a problem, because if you don't have too much pyrite, that calcium carbonate can mean a more rapidly weathering slate, and the way around it is that you make sure the slate's just much thicker. So as the acidic rain takes off more material over the years, you've got still more left to remain on the roof to work as a slate. So that's the key with a calcium carbonate rich material, is you need it much thicker when you lay it onto the roof, which means you might have to change your roof design to take that greater loading with a heavier gauge of slate.
But if you don't have a lot of reactive pyrite in the slate and the calcium carbonate figure is quite high, does that mean that it will just discolour it and it's an aesthetic issue?
Yes, and the problem with many of the calcium-rich slates is that they often start very, very dark, and you can't tell one from another. But give them a year on the roof, and those with the higher content of calcium carbonate will often appear white. There'll be those which will have almost none, and they will still appear dark, and you'll end up with an absolute patchwork material on your roof. And that's the nature of these calcium carbonate rich slate materials, is they just weather very rapidly and discolour in all sorts of ways that will give you not the roof that you are probably hoping for. And it's very critical, especially with Chinese materials, to be very aware of the calcium carbonate content and its variation. It's often the variation is the problem. If they all had the same amount of carbonate in them, it would weather more evenly and wouldn't be noticed so much. But it's this completely random weathering that becomes a problem.